off when this happened. And we need to fix that problem. Part of it that we've done here in the Alexandria Police Department is adopt the 21st century policing approach. But I got to tell you, when we sit back and look at this, we start wondering if we're doing enough. And so I'm here to listen and respond to any questions that come up. But be assured, I and my folks are very upset about what took place in Minneapolis. That is not professional policing. And frankly, it's a crime that we witnessed on that video. And for that, on behalf of the professional policing community, I'm sorry we had to look at it. And again, I'll turn it back over to you, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I will ask any questions. And we have a number of things that we're going to do in terms of community outreach. We have a community outreach virtual meeting on Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. You can access that information from the city website. We're going to be setting up a number of things to listen across the city, the police department, because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing in the right way. But that said, I'll just leave it at that point and let my colleagues weigh in.
Thank you, Chief Brown. I want to first of all apologize to everyone. I've just been informed that there is a limit of 100 people. We are at that limit and several people are trying to get in. I apologize. They're not here, so they won't hear my apology, though I did set the recording button so folks can hear the rest of this conversation in the future. Again, I did not know of that limitation in advance. It's my own fault. I take full responsibility. I am not necessarily the best tech whiz. I'm going to try to see if I can figure out during this meeting a way to expand it. But again, please let people know that that was never my intent to limit the meeting, and it's just my own flaws there in not understanding technology. I apologize. Let me move on to Chief Farr. He issued a public statement earlier, but I'm sure he has a few words to say now.
Delegate Levine, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be here today. Many of the things that Chief Brown said, I think we'd be consistent with as far as adopting the President Obama's future policing initiatives. And I think in the Northern Virginia region, are very consistent in how we go about trying to, have a level of professionalism that's bar none. But I got to tell you, first and foremost, anytime an officer like we witnessed in Minneapolis does what they do, a gross miscarriage of justice, and that's all it is. We can't call it anything but what it was. Sets every one of us back for all the work that we spend. I know Alexandria, I know Arlington invest a tremendous amount of time in making sure that we have the relationships, we are open with our communities, we set things in place so there's an opportunity to voice dissent, there's an opportunity to come with us with your concerns. We encourage and always look for any way that someone, if they have a complaint or if they have an issue with the police department, to bring it forward. And so you start to feel you're making a little bit of headway, and then something happens somewhere else in the country and it sets us back multiple paces in a single sweep. And that is so unfortunate, not just for us, but for the entire country. And I know I want to really get to the questions, so I think we can answer a lot of what's in here today, but I think you hit upon a fundamental issue when we bring somebody on board. The first thing that we talk about, and I adopted this years ago, is our responsibility to the U.S. Constitution. When I was listening before, I teach a class to every single new recruit that goes over the preamble of the Constitution and why it matters. And I think our officers truly need to understand that they are not anything but a representation of the community they serve. And so a lot of our focus is to make sure that they understand that we are only in the position we are, and we only have the authority we have is because our community entrusts us to do the right thing. And so I look forward to answering the questions. I know that there's quite a few of them and some challenging ones, but that's why we're here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chief Farr. Let me go briefly, and then we will get to your questions, but I don't know if Brian Porter wants to say a few words. Go ahead, please, Brian.
Thank you. First of all, Delegate Herring, Delegate Levine, thank you for hosting this really important meeting. It's unfortunate that that we have to have meetings like this. Obviously, I personally, as a human being, share in the outrage that those on this call and many others in the community feel. In a professional capacity, it's interesting. I frequently am put in a position where it's difficult for me to weigh in on cases that occur so far away in the country because I feel like I'm not privy to all of the information. However, in this particular case, that video is the only evidence any prosecutor in the country would need to establish what was necessary to bring a murder case. And I think it's important for people to understand that obviously we've got a long ways to go, but the community interest, the community concern, the fact that citizens are now using videos to highlight these injustices and providing evidence for investigators and for prosecutors to try their best to bring criminal cases, the anger, the concern, the ethos of the community does matter. And I have seen over the course of my career a much different viewpoint on how these cases are investigated, how law enforcement officers and law enforcement agencies go about investigating their own cases, how prosecutors go about weighing them. And obviously we haven't taken care of the problem yet, but I firmly hope to be part of the solution, and I definitely share the outrage and the concern of the community. So again, thank you for the opportunity to participate. And like Parisa and like the two police chiefs, I'm here to do my best to answer questions the community might have.
Thank you, Brian. And Parisa, Dehghani Tafti, of course, is the new Commonwealth attorney for Arlington. Parisa, you have a few words to say.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Delegate Levine and Delegate Herring, for putting this together very quickly and under very short time constraints. And thank you both, Chief Brown and Chief Farr, for joining in. I think your voices are incredibly important to this discussion. I have struggled with how to deal with this, both to support my staff in terms of my personal life and in terms of my role as the Commonwealth's attorney. And I keep going back to, the fact that I've seen a lot of really ugly things working in criminal law for nearly 2 decades. But I've rarely seen anything that approaches the utter horror of Officer Derek Chauvin's whole weight pressed on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he struggled to breathe, as he begged for his life, and as he asked for his mother. And I'm horrified, I'm bewildered, I'm angry, and I'm ashamed. I'm horrified at the awful sight of a human being taking the life of another. I'm bewildered because George Floyd was a civilian that Chauvin was sworn to protect, along with the rest of the community, regardless of what he was suspected of doing. And angry that after all this time, Black men and Black women still don't receive equal treatment at the hands of the criminal legal system. And I mean the entire system, myself included. And I'm ashamed that as a country, we haven't done nearly enough to account for the vestiges and continuing legacy of racial discrimination. And I just want to be clear at the outset that I think we have a lot of work to do. I do think Alexandria and Arlington have some of the finest departments in the country, but I think that we can and should continue to push to be better and to be leaders, and to do everything that we can to prevent this from happening to begin with. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Parisa, for those powerful words. So I'm going to start in with some of the questions. And I think the first sort of most obvious question is, what will we do if it happened here? So I'm going to start with Chief Brown. Chief Brown, if one of your officers, broad daylight or the middle of the night, was seen on video or even accused of handcuffing a man, putting him in a prone position, putting his knee on his neck for 8 minutes, begged by bystanders to stop, does not stop, and his 3 cohorts, 3 police officers by his side, are asked to intervene, and they don't intervene, what would you do?
Well, first of all, in looking at that video, if there was something like that that occurred in Alexandria, that officer would probably be booked in the city jail for homicide. And the additional officer would probably be charged too. I mean, quite frankly, I've been doing this stuff for a long time. And, you know, police officers are human. But what I saw in that video, should it ever occur in the city, is not only unacceptable, it's criminal. And you prosecute, I put it in Brian's shop, quite frankly, but those people shouldn't be wearing a badge, and they should frankly not be in a situation where they can exert any kind of authority over anybody. That's frankly just unacceptable conduct for any human being, even worse for a cop.
I'll get to Brian in a second, but Chief Brown, one of the things that I think most concerns people, at least most concerned me and many others, it's not just, okay, you've got a really bad person there, an officer Chauvin, but his three fellow officers, in some ways, I don't know if you can say more concerning, because nothing's more concerning than killing a man, but was very, very concerning, because that suggests to me it's not one bad person, but a systemic problem. None of those three officers stepped in. What do you teach your officers to do if they see one of their fellow officers breaking the law, killing a man? What do you train your officers to do to jump into such a situation?
Well, that training starts really at the academy to begin with, when they're first going through. You know, you don't allow that stuff to take place with fellow officers or with civilians or anyone who's engaged in it. Your job is to protect the individual that you're placing into custody. And, you know, quite frankly, that's what I struggle with in this particular case with Mr. Floyd. You know, there were three other officers by the video that I've been able to see. And I got to question why they didn't, just like you, stop it. Or more importantly, if they saw it, why didn't they take an enforcement action and place that person into custody, their fellow officer? That's what angers my folks. It angers me. And I think it angers most of the chiefs that you've heard about in the last week who have come forward and said, it's wrong. And, you know, that's not what we are as a profession. And so that, in that kind of case, zero tolerance. You know what, and let them sort it out in the court. If they can come up with some mitigating reason for that. The particular tactic that was used in this case of Mr. Floyd is not taught. In fact, if you think about it, basically, I would assume, cut off his carotid. And if that's the case, we abandoned the carotid hold in the early 80s because the Supreme Court said you couldn't use it. So I got to ask the question, why now? And that's what we struggle with. Parisa, you were talking about, you know, internally trying to struggle with these issues and what you saw in the video. Believe me, there's a lot of cops across this country who are struggling with that right now. And asking a lot of questions. But as to the other three, they failed miserably. And their conduct could be criminal as well. And I wonder why it's taken so long from a professional standpoint that we can't make that determination.
So I'll move on to Chief Farr, but the question is, there's fear among the community that the police protect each other more than they protect the community. And that's whether it's keeping, and again, I'm not casting aspersions on Arlington, Alexandria, I'm just saying it's a feeling across the country that police protect each other, that if they see another police officer doing wrong, they're more apt to protect their colleague and friend who they've worked with for a long time and maybe ridden in the car and spent lengths of time together than the community. How would those three even have intervened? How does a police officer stop a fellow police officer committing a crime, committing a murder? I mean, it's not easy to do. Do you have training for Arlington police officers to teach them what to do if one of their police officers is committing a murder? How do they?
I think you're talking about a much bigger thing than the single incident. Everybody's focused on the single incident. What that video showed me, as I look at that, I look at a systemic problem with that department, and a training issue and a cultural issue that goes much deeper than a single incident. I mean, I get oftentimes deals as we bring people up through the system. I told you it's from the get-go. Our priority here is to make people understand what their duties and responsibilities are to the community, to the citizens, and to each other. And to Chief Brown's point, you're absolutely right. A case like that happened with the exact same parameters in Arlington, we'd be in the Commonwealth's office, and it would be considered a misuse of force, and it would probably be, depending on where we were, a homicide case in this as well. But I have to go back and say, how do we ever get to the point where one of those officers didn't realize that they have a positional asphyxiation thing that's going on right in front of them? And not one of them had the sense to say, hey, you need to set that guy up. He's under control. He's not fighting with you anymore. Set him up. I suggest to you that that happened because the culture there allows it to happen, right? So when we, oftentimes I'll have officers, young officers, get less than happy about the fact that we take some level of discipline on them for minor infractions, whether it has something to do with, maybe speeding in a car or how they approach somebody or how they dealt with someone. And they don't quite get it when they're brand new as why is the police department so particular about addressing the small things. But I truly believe that if you address the small things, you hire the right person, you compensate them properly, and you do the discipline that needs to be done on people who need a direction, that you keep yourself from ever getting to the point where I'd have officers standing around watching that activity take place. And I'm happy to say that in my 5 years as a chief here, and I'm on my 30th year with this department, I've had officers intervene in cases over the years where they have come and said, look, I thought Officer X was out of line, and they've made a complaint, and we've taken action on that. So, I mean, it's actually a really good thing when a chief can say, I've got officers that are willing to step up and say, look, that's out of line, and it's not going to hold. On the whole concept of officers protecting each other, of course, you're always, coworkers and friends, yes. So you're going to always have some degree of, you want to make sure that everybody's doing the right thing, and then you're not taking running to the boss every time somebody didn't call in sick or something else. But on anything serious, that's the culture of the agency, and it has to start from day one.
Brian, would you have any trouble prosecuting not just Officer Chauvin, but the other 3 officers? Are there any holes in Virginia law that would keep you from prosecuting all 4 of them? And in general, how does your office deal with complaints of police violence?
Well, thank you. I mean, the first question, there is absolutely no doubt, in my opinion, that all of those officers could be charged. In Virginia, we have accomplice liability. So it's not necessary to prove that an individual person actually put their knee on the decedent's neck, okay? If they are in a position where they are encouraging it, or alternatively, perhaps in a position where they could have intervened and stopped it and did not, and it was apparent to them that what was going on was a gross overuse of force, all of them could be charged under accomplice liability, and indeed could be charged with murder. And in my opinion, from what I've seen from the video evidence, it would be a very strong case to charge all of them. And I don't want to make assumptions about what's going on in Minneapolis, but I would assume that we're going to see charges against the other officers at some point in the near future. As far as how my office goes about it, well, the first thing I would point out, and I think the same is true for Parisa's office, we don't have investigators, okay? My office is a office of lawyers, right? So we receive cases that have been investigated by law enforcement agencies and then make determinations. I can't really speak for Arlington, but I do know that currently the Alexandria Police Department does not investigate its own use of force, officer-involved shootings, deadly force. That's farmed out to another law enforcement agency. I'll let Chief Brown speak to that. I don't want to put words in his mouth. I also think that there's currently a regional response to these types of things that law enforcement officers or law enforcement agencies are looking into having independent organization or task force to look into these types of use of force allegations. So, in my opinion, the best thing is for a law enforcement agency to not investigate their own with regards to deadly force situations. I think that's asking too much of the investigators. I think the best idea is to have an outside agency look at use of force, deadly force situations. And then the way our office would work with it is we would work with whatever agency or whatever unit is doing that investigation to make a determination about charging. So that's how it would work.
So I'm going to get you, Chris, in a second, but first I actually want to follow up on what Brian said and go right to Chief Brown. Chief Brown, what do you do? How do you handle investigating yourself? One of your officers is accused of violent misconduct. How would they be investigated?
Well, we would handle it like we do with the use of force. About a year and a half ago, we changed our policies where we don't investigate our own use of force involving, a weapon, for example. If we had something similar to that, we would ask for someone outside to look at it so we can eliminate or at least reduce the possibility of investigation contamination. Let me go back to something that you made, and it's an assumption that law enforcement does try to circle the wagons, as one of the folks said in the chat room. And it may happen, I'm sure it does. But we do a lot of different things now to try to eliminate that. For example, we track the behavior of our officers through all investigations and complaints and everything else. We have flags and triggers that come to us when an officer starts to populate. That's what concerned me about this Minnesota officer. Reports with the reports that came out that said that he had multiple issues in the past. And the key for that is you have to be able to jump in there, deal with that thing before it becomes problematic. And to Jay's point, that may be a cultural thing. We don't accept that here in Alexandria, and I think most of Northern Virginia chiefs feel the same way and have similar policies and protocols. The other thing that's there is, in order for it to be considered objective in the public's eye when you have a major situation of this type, you need to be objective, and you can't sometimes investigate your own. And that's why we changed our policy. We have the Virginia State Police right now. We call them when we're doing anything involving a discharge of weapon. We've used other agencies, including the VSP, to do other things in terms of involving our employees, and we'll continue to do that. But let me also add one thing that I'm pleased to hear about. We have officers that tell on officers when they're not behaving properly, and it gives us a chance to look at it. And that speaks to the professionalism of today's officers. Years ago, when I started in the 70s, that wasn't always the case. And that's why it hurts so much for some of these cops, because they put a lot of heart and soul in this thing, and they're angry that we're even having this conversation because of one individual who was not only way out of line, but did criminal conduct, and they're angry at him.
Chief Farr, briefly, do you investigate your own or do you farm that out?
No, we don't farm it out, and partly is if you got a chance to experience the level of training and expertise that the agency actually has for cases of this type, the confidence level I have in our ability of our staff to do an appropriate investigation is there. I do know that this has been an ongoing, continuing topic, and one of the things that I am currently looking at, and I think Brian alluded to this, and I'm not sure if it'll ever happen, but one of the things I'm looking at with my partner agencies in the region is that if you look at Alexandria and Fairfax, Loudoun, and the Northern Virginia region, there's an extensive amount of forensics capability here. And we have really capable, qualified folks who do a lot of outstanding investigations on everybody every day. And so to not utilize those tools seems to me not to make a lot of sense. However, I understand that you'd like to have some opportunity to have a little bit broader look at things. And so we are looking at the possibility of taking a regional approach where we would develop a team of investigators that could be called to these serious types of cases with seriously bodily injury or death, and come in and be a collective that would work and do an investigation and provide an opportunity to present to the Commonwealth a complete investigation that is done by a collaborative group. So it's not just that originating agency, there's other checks in there. And the other check that comes into play, of course, is we do present to the Commonwealth attorney, who does have an opportunity to review everything we do and make a determination as to whether or not there are issues or concerns with that case before we could ever move forward one way or the other. So at this point, no, we don't currently go to the state police to do our investigations, but we are certainly looking at other options.
All right, well,
And Mark, if I could jump in, we're working with Jay on that issue and with Brian to look as an option for leveraging, if you will, some of the investment we've made in Northern Virginia in terms of investigations. So we just think an independent look is important. We opted to go to the Virginia State Police because we didn't have this kind of concept in place at that time.
Chief Farr, let me get to Parisa in 1 second. I've been holding you for a while, but Chief Farr, what if a citizen of Arlington doesn't believe that you have been fair or you could be fair, rightly or wrongly? They may be right, they may be wrong. They fear that the police are protecting one another. They want a citizen review panel or someone else to take a look at it. They may specifically say, an officer has a conflict of interest. I mean, you can imagine situations where this would come up where Arlington maybe should investigate itself. I don't know if you have a comment on that, but do you think there should be some kind of citizen review commission or some way for people to go around the police if they feel the police aren't policing the police effectively?
There have been in the past where we've had cases where somebody is questioning the investigation or didn't think we did it thorough enough or thought there was some level of bias to it. I cannot speak for the current Commonwealth. The prior Commonwealth was more apt to take that individual in and work with them and talk to every single point of the investigation and why it went where it went and what their issues or concerns might be. But we have not looked at an outside citizen review panel. I know that Fairfax County has one that reviews cases after the fact. So it's not that they're not going to dictate how the investigation goes, but there's a review of the investigation. That seems to be a model that's been somewhat accepted up in this area. So we've not considered them yet. We haven't had a hard push in our community for them. So I think it's just a matter of if it might be something we consider as an option down the road.
Okay, Parisa, sorry, kept you on mute for a while. Let me go back, first of all, to the question I asked Brian, which is, would you have any trouble prosecuting any of the 4 officers? And then move on to address some of the other issues that we talked about since then about how the police themselves.
So the answer to the first question is simply no. Based on what I've seen in the video, and I too, like Brian, am concerned about jumping to conclusions in cases and know that, cases as they've been reported that my office has handled in the past few months, they don't quite get reported with accuracy, and there's plenty of information that I am in no position to disclose and can't. But I agree with Brian that this is one of those situations where the video speaks for itself and is, I think Chief Farr said, I'm not sure if it was Chief Farr, sorry, or Chief Brown, but that this incident is a symptom of a broader cultural problem within that department. And the best way to avoid these things from happening is to make sure that there's a culture that is accountable for small things and large things. And in terms of the other question, and I would treat it like any other case. Is there probable cause? What are the mitigating factors? And can we prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt? And I think that this is pretty clear. Based on the video and what happened on the video. I really support the regional task force and so excited that we are having these conversations. I think it solves a lot of the problems that were happening with delays with the Virginia State Police. I think it creates a really good system of checks and balances. And I think that it draws on the strengths of the various departments in the region, and allows departments that are not quite as big to tap into some of the resources that some of the bigger departments have. I think that actually that makes my job and Brian's job easier to have a task force like that and to not have agencies policing themselves, because then we have a broader perspective of what happens. And I just think about it in terms of my own office. If somebody were accused of wrongdoing in my office, I wouldn't be investigating them myself. I had a case once where I was challenging the conviction on the basis of innocence in one jurisdiction, and one of the 10 judges in the jurisdiction had been involved in that case from 40 years ago. And what the entire bench did was recuse themselves. And so they ended up asking for a substitute judge from another jurisdiction to come in and hear the case. And so I think that, I have complete faith in Arlington County Police Department's competence. And I don't think competence is an issue. I think it's, and I think that everybody would try to be very, very sincere. And I think that that's true of most departments and most offices. I just think that it makes sense to have an outside check so that the appearance is of objectivity is there, and so that there can be enhanced trust.
Okay, I have a lot of questions. Oh, go ahead.
Mark, can I add one other thing? We're kind of unique in our city. We actually have a memorandum of understanding with our Human Rights Commission, and we brief the executive board on any use of force and the investigations that we do with that. And occasionally we also get asked about the individual officer's history, and we're very transparent with them under that MOU, and that provides for us another look beyond the Commonwealth's attorney in terms of looking at the things that our officers are doing and how we're evaluating their behavior. And I actually think that it may not be a citizens review board, but in de facto it is, because they ask some very critical questions for us during that period of time.
Well, Chief Brown, there are a couple tough questions, pointed questions directed at you relating to your transparency, so let me ask them. First, from Abdul Rahman El Nubi, says for Chief Brown, and I'm just going to quote what he writes here: whenever I see on the streets of Alexandria a car pulled over and being searched, it's always a black driver. Never have I seen a white driver in that situation, and it's usually more than one police car present. I wonder what procedures do officers follow to decide who to search? Is the data available on how many drivers are being searched, sorted by race? Are all of these drug stops? I hope not, since we all know white people use drugs at the same rates as black people. However, the impression average citizen would get from seeing black people are they the only ones being searched? Is that black people are more likely to commit crimes or more likely suspects? That only enforces the stereotypes. And related to his question is a question from Gilly Campbell. Again, quite pointed at you, Chief Brown. Quote, Chief Brown has completely failed to honor the data transparency agreement the Alexandria Police Department made in 2018 with Alexandria NAACP, Tenants and Workers United, and Grassroots Alexandria. How will the city enforce requirements for APD data transparency, unquote. So a couple tough questions directed your way, sir.
Well, that's quite all right. In fact, let me go back. In 2017, when I first came on, we had George Mason University come and develop a model for us to report our traffic citation data and the demographics therein. We've been posting it since 2017. In fact, the latest edition was posted just last week. It's on our website. You're welcome to, you're invited to look at it if you want. It talks about what our experience is with stopping people. And it also is a model that was developed, again, by George Mason University. And we count not only citations issues, but traffic stops that are recorded as well. And we look in that process for individuals who tend to be stopping certain individuals on a more frequent basis on an individual type process. That said, we know that I have created also a team that helps me with the 21st Century Policing initiative that we have. And on that team has been a representative from Tenants and Workers, and they've been fully briefed and involved in this, along with some of our other communities on the West End, communities representing different demographics. Casa Chililagua has been on there as well, and they've had that information. And we're continuing to refine that information. We're now looking at how we can code and look at community outreach efforts across the city and other kinds of contacts we make that don't necessarily result in an arrest or even a traffic warning. And I think this year we're collecting at least what we think will be really good data after making some modifications to our data collection process. So As far as the data goes, I invite you to take a look at that report because it'll answer many of your questions.
There have been many questions, and I'll start this one with Chief Farr, but there have been many questions about training, safeguards, whistleblowing. Natalie Church asked many of these about how police keep their fellow officers in check. Susan Fratsky wants to know she asked in Alexandria, I'll start with you, Chief Farr, in Arlington, but we'll get to Chief Brown in a minute, regarding use of force, de-escalation, engagement. What are the training, are your policies being reviewed and updated in light of best practices? Many questions along this line of how you train police officers. How do they learn to de-escalate conflict? Jeanette Love has many of these kinds of questions. How are officers trained to intervene when they see someone else going on? What does a civilian do if they feel threatened by police? I thought that was a very good question, because my thought was, who would I call if I were in Minneapolis and I saw a police officer mistreating or killing a citizen? Do I call the police? I mean, what do you do in terms of training, and what do you advise a citizen to do if they witness police misconduct? I'll start with Chief Farr.
All right. Well, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, I know that.
But let's start with the training part. So, fundamentally, probably the most important part of the training, beyond what you get in the academy, because everybody gets a basic academy. They get the implicit bias training in the academy. They get some basic de-escalation skills in the academy. But we continue with people throughout their career here with the mandatory training. But probably the biggest single thing that's really helped us with the de-escalation factor is almost, I think we're just about 80% of every single one of our patrol officers is now thoroughly trained in crisis intervention training. And a big component of the crisis intervention training is really having a way to understand how to de-escalate situations. And there's no surprise that a large number of the people we encounter out here that are maybe involved in some level of lower level criminal activity also have some serious mental health issues. And a lot of that sort of relate to each other, but we make sure that they get extensive training in crisis intervention. There's retraining in that on a recurrent basis, and it's a matter of constantly updating that to make sure that it's, as you pointed out, are we current in our policies? We are an accredited agency. We review all of our policies on a yearly basis to make sure that we stay consistent with that. So between what's current in the field, and what's current in our crisis intervention training, and what's current in our day-to-day training, all those things help our officers have better tools so that when we respond to a call, we have the entire tool set to work with somebody. And more often than not, we're very successful in being able to deal with somebody without ever resorting to any type of physical intervention or any type of force. So I'm very happy to see how many times our officers have been able to move people through the system without having to move to a hands-on or an actual physical approach to somebody. I'm trying to remember the other question.
The other thing's about a civilian calling in. I'll put that aside. I'll get back to that, I promise. But
Okay.
let me just ask you, and again, this is Catherine Algeri's question. Tammy Schieffer writes, quote, how will police show Black residents that they will protect them rather than brutalize them? Just a very basic, raw question. Catherine Algeria writes, what type of anti-bias trainings are in place? What do police officers learn about implicit racial bias? You mentioned some of that occurs at the academy. I had one constituent tell me that they had been to that academy and saw video, and in the video, the only people who were being arrested in this 70s, 80s era video, 90s, were Black people. It's clearly, it sounds like the implicit bias video, or one of the videos has its own bias. Let's be blunt, what do white cops learn about their own implicit biases to make sure that they're treating all citizens equally? I'll start with Chief Brown on that one.
Yeah, frankly, going back to what Jay just said a moment ago about the basic training, we don't stop there. We have, as part of even the program of our field testing or field operational training, we started talking about de-escalation. We talk about treating people with respect. When someone comes into the department, I have a conversation with them And I talked to them about what we need to do is respect all people, because the only way we earn respect is by respecting others. And that comes into the daily stuff that we do day in, day out, that we ask them to do on the street. We have, in addition to the training that is normal and customary for most of the Northern Virginia departments, we also provide our people with another dose of implicit bias training. In fact, we started that when we adopted the 21st Century Policing Program. That program has, in one of the pillars, one of the actions items is to do implicit bias training. And everybody, including myself, went through that training. And the effort is not to necessarily to protect one class or another, to respect everybody we come in contact with. And we also monitor, like I say, complaints when they come in. And there's a lot of ways for that to take place. You can contact us, obviously, but we also handle whistleblower complaints. We have complaints that come in to the Human Rights Commission. There's complaints that come in by way of 311 even. And so there's a lot of ways to touch or to get that report back to us to look at, or in some cases, someone else to look at, depending on the allegations. So there's a lot of ways to access that. But in terms of the bias training.
Yeah, what does it consist of? Give me an example. Tell me what do people learn in that training? How does it go about? What does it look like to those of us who haven't had that training?
Well, the first thing we did a couple of years ago when we did the initial training, we made sure that everyone understood the EEO law and those kinds of things. But then the bias training itself is a multi-hour course where we talk about where people can understand where their biases are, how their biases influence their behavior, recognizing how they need to hold their biases in check, especially if they're in uniform or exercising their police officer powers. They also talk about the consequences for not doing that as well. And this is a format that runs along the same format that was developed and recommended by the 21st Century Policing Task Force.
Chief Farr, I'm sort of following up and trying to put all these questions here, but this is from Wes Rist, and he writes, do you collect data on racial profiling, including data related to traffic stops, stop and frisk, other routine police practices, as well as demographic data, aggressive treatment, impressions of outward identities such as race, age, and gender, and post-stop activities such as searches and recovery of contraband? Do you analyze collected data to determine whether racially skewed patterns of enforcement emerge?
So as far as collection of data, I mean, anytime we make an arrest, every time we make a stop, all that information is collected. And it's not uncommon that we distribute and put that back out to the community if they have questions about what's our ratio of stops in a given area, what's our ratio for arrest. I mean, all that is captured, and it's probably going to be captured even to a greater degree beginning July 1st, because the state of Virginia is going to set up a system that's we're going to require a report back on an annual basis to Virginia State Police. It has a pretty broad set of criteria, but mostly it's the reason for the stop, when was the stop, who was stopped, what was the race of the individual, were they searched or not searched, was it consent or not consent. I mean, it's a pretty comprehensive data set that I think—
For the record, I co-patron that bill, but keep going, sir.
So anyway, so that bill is coming, and so we've been making the modifications to get that out. The other thing, though, that anytime we do random checks to get a sense of who's stopping, you know, the most probably the reliable thing for us to get a sense of is somebody making stops based upon selection versus a call for service is traffic, because traffic is the one that's usually the one that's self-initiated. Responding to a shoplifter at the mall or responding to a domestic or whatever, a call for service really is not. But traffic are really indicative to give us a sense of what officers are doing. And anytime I have any kind of complaint or issue concerning a racial bias complaint or whatever it might be, it is a deep dive back into the data for us to do a really hard look at these officers to say, is there something there would suggest that there is some validity to that call? Are we seeing a disproportionate number of stops based upon the total race demographics of the area they're working in? And so we look at those all the time. We have very few racial bias complaints. I only had 5 in the entire last year that were called in. Now, you can make the argument somebody might not call us, and I understand that. But the same as Chief Brown said, you can call the police department, you can call ECC, you can call EEO, you can send a thing through There are multiple avenues through the county manager's office, through the county board office. I get these from everybody. We take
You can
every
also
single
call
one.
your local and state elected politicians.
Yes,
If you want
yes.
to confidentially say that you think something is going on, I will certainly keep you confidential. You can also talk to Brian Porter and Parisa, Dehghani, Tafti. So I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, but you're absolutely right. So there are multiple avenues to bring those in, but I can tell you that once a case comes in, every one of our cases or complaints are tracked. They're tracked through our system. They're tracked through an internal system. And I think that one of the important things is if I dismiss an officer here for cause, that information doesn't disappear. It's available for the next agency down the road. You hear these stories where somebody has done all types of egregious things in one agency, moves somewhere else, and they can do it again. It's not going to happen because the information is going to get released.
So I know our chiefs and our elected, our Commonwealth attorneys have to leave soon, but yet there's two big pressing things I need to get across, and then I'll be here for another hour. And anyone who wants to stay, of course, please stay. But the two big questions that I do need to ask you both. One is the assessments done prior to police officers getting the job, assessments of racial bias, assessments of complaints. The officer who murdered George Floyd is reported to have had 17 complaints against him in a 20-year career. Does Alexandria or Arlington have any officers with similar records? What is the average number of complaints against a police officer? How do you ensure that police officers who've been found in other areas, maybe they came from Minneapolis or Louisville, and have had history of complaints against them for using excessive force against Black and brown people, how do you ensure those officers do not join our local police forces? Chief Brown, I'll start with you.
Thank you. That's a big issue for us. We want to make sure that whoever we're going to train and put on the street has got the right skill set, the right temperament, and the right frame of mind to be a cop. All of us kind of do the same thing. We do an extensive background check on the individual, pre-employment. We do a psychological examination on the individual. We also do, we vet the people in some cases when they're looking at someone that's coming over as a lateral, so that we can make sure we have the right stuff, if you will. That includes going back and looking at their disciplinary history and other kinds of things. And I think that's a general theme you'll find across law enforcement. That's what, in my earlier comments, that's what baffled me in this Minneapolis case, to hear the reports of these kinds of things. And if true, you've got to ask the question, how did you miss that? Because I think in the profession, as Jay pointed out earlier, that we find that, that's not what should be a police officer, if in fact it's true. And that's maybe a cultural thing in terms of hiring. We all want to have extra officers. We all want to try to fill vacancies, and recruiting from this business is difficult in many cases, but we're not that desperate. And, if we had somebody that had that kind of a record, we wouldn't hire them, period. They can stay where they're at or do whatever they got to do, but not certainly work for us.
Chief, can you always get records? I mean, if someone comes from Idaho, can you get the Boise, Idaho Police Department? Is it possible that you could miss something?
Yeah, we actually look at their file to the extent that we can. In some cases, we've actually had people travel out to if it's someplace close. But you'd be surprised what will be shared in many of these background investigations for a new hire. Now, there's always a possibility somebody could conceal that from us, but that's not been the practice that I've seen or had reported to me. I actually look at the background packages as every new hire, and they're pretty extensive. 20, 30, in some cases 40 pages. I read every single word, and I look for cues. The same thing goes with the individuals in their psych exam, because I want to understand who I'm hiring before I put them in an academy or give them a badge. So, and I think that's normal and customary. Delegate, I'm going to have to run. With all the things that are going on right now, you can imagine I pushed some meetings back that I have to attend to deal with the safety of the city of Alexandria, and I'm actually kind of late for this one. So I'm going to apologize, but I want to thank you for doing this. These are good questions. I hope to have the opportunity to spend more time listening sometime soon, but it's kind of strange times right now.
Thank you, Chief Brown, and thank you for your time and being here. And I see Chief Farr had to leave as well. I we ran out of time. There's more questions to ask, and I'll keep asking to the extent that Brian or Parisa can stick around a little bit longer, but they have to go soon too. If not, I will try to address these questions as best I can. The body cameras question I'm saving for myself because that's something I've been working on and I can answer. The only sort of last question I have, and unfortunately I was going to ask it of the police, but it has to do with the violence that's occurring around the nation. Oh, Chief Farr is back. Great, fantastic. I lost you there, but you're back again. So great. So I do want to ask you that question, Chief Farr. Obviously, we protect the right of people to protest peacefully. We have seen in our neighbor across the river already buildings aflame, and of course, Minneapolis, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia. We all know what happened last night. We all pray to God it never happens in Arlington or Alexandria. But Chief Farr, how would you handle a peaceful protest that parts of it turn violent? How do you have procedures in place to address that if it were, God forbid, to happen in Arlington?
I wish I had the perfect answer for you, but I can tell you where we've changed our tactics over time. The traditional model of the old civil defense unit, everybody would put on, you see them all in a lineup, and they would treat everything as a single line and move people back without a lot of flexibility and without a lot of discretion about where they were focusing their efforts has really changed. The CDU units, or civil disturbance units that are out there today, are much more aligned with a tactical response, and I mean it in a positive way. The vast majority of people are out there are protesting. That's what they're doing. They have an absolute constitutional right to protest. No objection to that. Then we find, there's all types of opinions, and I don't want to get too deep in this, but there tends to be some level of a group, a subset of the group that is really hell-bent on some violent activity. What we are learning to do, I think, better, and still need to keep practicing this, is how do you focus your efforts to get the individuals out of the group that are really inciting the violence, but allow the rest of the people that want to continue the protest. And so our tactics are really designed to help take the people out of the protest that their sole purpose is to cause damage to property, and more importantly, cause damage or risk of damage or life. Move those out, get them under control, and allow the people that are going to protest peacefully protest. And that is really our primary objective. And the last couple times I've looked at the reports and I've seen feedback, it's very typical that it's not our community, Arlingtonians, Alexandrians, that are causing the outbreak or the violence. It's from somewhere from outside the area. And so we do our very best to try to capture that and capture the individuals that are most likely to cause serious damage. But it's a really tough call.
Thank you, Chief. I've got some questions for the prosecutors. This is from Tom Clancer. Nationwide, it seems like in the few cases where officers are charged, they escape accountability with qualified immunity claims. What limits do we have in Virginia on qualified immunity claims about abuse cases? Brian?
All right, well, qualified immunity is a civil doctrine. It talks about civil immunity from civil lawsuits for being sued. And I'll be quite honest, Delegate Levine, that's really not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is criminal law. In criminal law, qualified immunity has no place. In other words, qualified immunity is not a defense to a criminal charge brought against an officer.
Okay, but officers do have the legal use of force that us civilians don't have. How does the fact that they can legally use force, how does that come into play in a criminal prosecution against a police officer like the one that killed George Floyd?
Sure. Well, in the George Floyd case, what you have is incontrovertible video evidence of what I would call malicious activity. All right. So malice means the intentional doing of a harmful act to another human being. Obviously, the officer was or should have been aware that what he was doing was causing extreme distress to a defenseless human being. And yet it continued on for just an inordinate amount of time. It's just really outrageous behavior. And on that evidence, I think it would be relatively easy for me as a prosecutor to establish malicious intent and be able to prosecute for murder. When you have other kinds of cases, and I don't really want to get into the details of these cases, but I have had in my career to charge several police officers or law enforcement officers with violence. I've had at least 3 different cases in my career where I've indicted law enforcement officers. Sometimes the facts can be more difficult in that there is a claim that it was a reasonable use of force. And that really is the standard in criminal law. It's the totality of the circumstances surrounding the encounter. Was the use of force that the officer employed reasonable under the circumstances? And sometimes that is a decision that a jury is going to be asked to make in a criminal trial. And then it will be down to 12 citizens who are impaneled as a jury having to decide whether, in light of all the circumstances, it was a reasonable use of force. But I don't think, in my opinion, I think it would be hard to find 12 citizens who did not agree. That what we saw in Minnesota was, beyond the pale. Definitely not just a case of negligence, but a case of intentional, criminal, malicious activity. And I think that prosecution is likely to be successful.
Parisa, Dehghani, Tafti, do you have any differences in prosecuting a police officer from prosecuting an ordinary civilian? I mean, there are provisions in the law, are they not, that allow a police officer to use force in a way civilians can't. How do those come into play in a prosecution against a police officer?
I would second what Brian says, is that it really is looking at the totality, which includes the privileges and responsibilities that the police officers enjoy. And the way that I think it comes most into play, and again, I haven't had a chance, I've only been the chief prosecutor for a few months. I hope never to have the opportunity to prosecute one of these cases. But if it did come up, I would be looking at, and I think that the most recent case law would support looking at an officer's training to help inform the analysis of intent and reasonableness. So I think that when you're part of you would look at video, you would look at 911 calls, you would look at witness statements, and you would look at training as well, to see, sort of, are they acting outside of that training or not? And I think that's the place where being a police officer makes the real difference, is that there is training.
Chief Farr, Rebecca Ziegler wants to know, have police departments deprioritized enforcement of activities that do not threaten public safety? She gives examples of marijuana possession, consumption of alcohol on the streets, disorderly conduct, trespassing, loitering, disturbing the peace, including loud music, spitting, jaywalking, ride a bicycle on the sidewalk. Have you deprioritized those, or do you have any intention of deprioritizing those that, according to Rebecca Ziegler, do not threaten public safety?
I would not say it's a deprioritization. It's probably, on most of the things she was talking about, the much lesser offenses, it's not an area that we really focus any time and effort on. And if I'm going to get the bike, somebody sitting outside their house having a beer, which technically is drinking in public, or a couple other things, we're not engaged the vast majority of the time to work those calls or to even make a proactive stop on it. It's generally, if I get a complaint of that nature, it's because someone else has called in and made a complaint. And if they've called in and made a complaint, we're going to go down and look at it. But I feel confident that our officers take the appropriate response in the vast majority of these lesser cases, with a verbal warning or a little bit of education about not riding there or not doing something out in public. It is not about putting a criminal charge on somebody. That's just not, it's just not us. There are times when we'll get I'll give you a typical example. Somebody will talk about, well, the police investing a lot of time in single use, you're smoking a joint. We're not. But more often than not, if I get a call, it's because somebody who lives in the apartment next door says, I'm constantly smelling the marijuana, I'm tired of it, what are you going to do about it? And we're sort of obligated to look into that, and we do, but I think we take appropriate action on it. I want to, Parisa did make one statement about a responsibility, and she's absolutely right. When it comes down to the police use of force, we have a privilege in the fact that we don't have some level of immunity, but it's because we have a responsibility to do it properly and judiciously. And so we dedicated a while back a tactical training unit that their entirety of their purpose is to make sure that we train people correctly, that we follow the law as the law is currently, and that we protect those things. So if I have someone who's going to be reviewed, I am confident that the training and the policies are going to be such that they are providing the proper guidance and the proper training. And if something is stepped out, it's because somebody stepped outside of what they were provided.
Briefly, I think I know their answers, but I'll start with you, Brian. Your belief about prosecuting for these kinds of offenses I just named.
Well, obviously, that is not a priority of my office. In my personal opinion, there is a very, very small number of violent individuals that we have to prioritize our resources on. And I'm talking about truly violent crimes, shooting people, stabbing, robberies, armed robberies, murders. So in my office, we do not have, we don't even play a role. I have chosen not to appear in some of those really minor nuisance offenses like traffic infractions, drinking in public, drunk in public, urinating in public. We do make appearances in the more serious misdemeanor offenses, assault and battery, for instance, minor thefts. But what we really try to focus on here in Alexandria is to try to get to the root causes of those types of issues. Okay, and so we've really focused on two of those areas. I'm pretty sure the chief would agree with me here, as well as Parisa. In my opinion, a lot of the day-to-day issues that law enforcement encounters are based on either substance abuse problems or mental health issues. And in many occasions, those are co-located. You've got both at the same time. And the way to kind of really address that is not to put people in jail. It's to try to address the underlying issues to help them so that they don't offend and they aren't breaking the law and they are becoming part of society and being an effective member and an effective citizen. And so we spent a lot of time working with our police department and with other agencies here in Alexandria, like the Department of Community Health, to focus on our mental health initiative, which is an initiative my office has instituted, in which we really try to get people treatment for underlying mental health issues. And also last year, we were very lucky to follow Arlington's lead, and we initiated a substance abuse treatment board, right? So that effort is to try to get people with substance abuse problems the treatment that they need to kind of kick the habit and thereby remove that drive for underlying nuisance offenses. So our my office's true emphasis is on using those very precious resources to go after very serious violent offenses. When we're confronted with people who are committing less serious nuisance offenses, either we're not entering an appearance or where we are, we're trying really hard to get people the treatment and the services that they need to kind of treat those underlying issues.
And Parisa, you ran a whole campaign kind of on this kind of thing, so I know your view on it, but why don't you restate it briefly?
I mean, I agree with Brian that we should be treating mental illness and substance abuse as the illnesses that they are, and we're hoping to we'll work on expanding the eligibility criteria for drug court, and it's been a little bit delayed, but we are scaling up a mental health or behavioral health docket. And it's been delayed because the trainings have been delayed as a result of COVID. And we are trying to focus our prosecutorial resources on serious crimes. And you know, there's enough of those to employ all of our resources. But I just want to make sure that, and like my office is working with the Department of Human Services, trying to come up with ways where we can have more interventions and have more services and make sure that everybody knows what services are available. And I congratulate ACPD for a recent program that they've started with DHS, where they go out, you know, and do true community policing, where they're reaching out to homeless populations along with somebody from DHS. And so they're actually riding together and reaching out to homeless populations and giving them food, giving them services that pointing them to services, giving them masks and gloves and hand sanitizer in these times. So I think that approach and shift to community policing and service-oriented and support-oriented treatments is really the way to go. That doesn't mean that those don't require resources. It's just a different kind of resources and a different focus on resources.
Chief Farr, we know about what happened to George Floyd because somebody recorded it. Would there be any restrictions if a citizen of Arlington saw a police stop and recorded it, took out their iPhone and recorded it and wanted to record it? I know that recently a CNN reporter, an African-American CNN reporter, was in, I think, Minneapolis with the camera and was arrested, actually, in the act of recording it. I don't think that was a particularly good moment for the Minneapolis Police Department. But would there be any restrictions? What would you tell your officers to do if someone starts filming?
I got to tell you, in this day and age, it is a common everyday occurrence for us. We get it all the time. And there is no restrictions. The only time the officers would ever say anything to anybody about filming is not for the mere fact of filming, but there may be times we don't want them to get into the crime scene we're working, or we have some reasons to barricade it off. But short of that, no, film away. There was a period in this country where it was a pretty popular thing to go around and see if you could bait the police into arresting you because you were filming them. Some of them took that. I'm thankful to say that we did not. We've never had an issue with that. I watched one of the officers in Minneapolis knock the camera away from the woman at the center. They're absolutely uncalled for. I was just aghast that they didn't even do that. You're in a public place. If you film it, you film it. I'm confident that we're going to do the right thing. So have at it.
So relating to the filming, I've always been a big supporter of police body cameras. And those of you know, I've been putting forward legislation for 5 years straight that finally became law this year. It's actually the first Virginia code on body cameras. It requires, if you have such a system, that you set up certain transparent guidelines ahead of time. I'm proud of that legislation. It's just a start in my view. I would like to see body cameras. I'll just bluntly, it's my own view, I've said it publicly, in all our communities in Alexandria or Arlington. The only complaint I've heard about them, it's a serious one, the only complaint I've heard about them is cost. I have not heard any complaints from any elected officials about the principle, which I strongly support, which is that whether it's body cameras or police car cameras, that cameras help everybody. They help the police when they're doing the right thing and the citizen's doing the wrong thing, and they help the citizen when they're doing the right thing and the police are doing the wrong thing. I know there's a concern about cost, and I know that in these COVID times when all our budgets are strapped, nothing's happening anytime soon. And I know that the cost is out of all of your bailiwicks, whether it's Chief Farr or Parisa or Brian. That's really an issue for me to deal with, for your elected officials to deal with. I want to let everyone on this call know that that's something I'm fighting for in both in state budgets and local budgets. And I recognize there's a cost. There's a cost. That's why I'm sort of short-circuiting the argument. There's a cost to have Brian and Parisa's staff review all of these tapes, and we've talked about it at length. So I don't want to talk about it for too long, except to ask this question, because the cost, that's not your concern, that's my concern. But my question is, do you have any philosophical opposition to body cameras, and what are you doing now with regard to them? I believe, Chief Farr, you have them on your police cars. Who has cameras and who doesn't in Arlington? So what's the state right now?
Right, all of our patrol vehicles do. If you see a marked unit, all the marked units, so all the officers are out there making traffic stops and day-to-day stuff have cameras in them now. As far as your question about philosophical things, no, we actually pushed forward a proposal for body-worn cameras last year. And you hit it on the head. It just came down another, and that's where it was. But you know, I think there was a day earlier on that there might have been some that were worried about the body-worn cameras and whether they'd really, demonstrate everything they need to demonstrate. And I've seen a ton of studies out there that show, depending on where the camera is, and depending on how you view things, it can be misleading. But really, the officers on this agency were very much for it, because as far as they're concerned and as far as I'm concerned, like I told you before, I'm extremely confident the only thing it's going to do is catch them recording doing their job properly. And frankly, the in-car cameras, they are a tremendous asset to us. I can't tell you how many times somebody's called in a complaint against one of our officers and said they've done X. And when we say, well, let's go to the video, that's the end of the complaint. So I don't think there's an agency around here that's absolutely opposed to them. I think really it's right now, I know for us, it was an extraordinary amount of money to enter. And then you could help me with this one. The data requirements in the state of Virginia, retention records are based upon keeping paper for 50 and 100 years. And they do not reflect what we need to do in a modern age. So we really need to catch up and get those in time with us with today.
That's a solid point, Chief Farr. We'll talk offline. I'll be more than willing to put in legislation that reflects today's reality, particularly with regard to data from cameras. Parisa, I know there's a cost. There's a cost to having all of your staff review it, and you're not responsible for that cost. It's partly my responsibility to get you money from Virginia and your local county board and city government who aren't represented here. So understanding that cost is the big problem, but still setting that biggest problem aside, apart from that big issue, which is getting you the money you need to handle it, are there any other problems you see with body-worn cameras? Or
no, I support the dash cams. I support body-worn cameras. I would support recording interrogations. I think that all of that, it helps, so, you know, as Chief Farr said, sort of solve he said, she said, situations. It's not going to solve everything 100%, but it provides somewhat objective evidence in many cases. And I think it increases community trust to have those things.
We're all big fans. Brian, you and I have been talking about body-worn cameras, I think ever since we both got elected. You know I'm a big fan, and you've told me about the cost, and I respect that. But apart from cost, which is a big, it's like, you know, I get it, except for the biggest problem, what are the other problems? But that's not your job to get you funding. That's my job. That's the job of our local officials who are very strapped right now given COVID. I know it's not going to happen in 2020, but theoretically, philosophically, apart from the big issue of cost, do you have a problem with body cameras?
Not only do I not have a problem with it, I'm 100% behind it. And the cost is an issue, but that should not be, in my opinion, a barrier to getting it done, right? And when it comes to cost, all that really matters, and I think Parisa would agree with me on this, we have to have extra personnel in the prosecutor's office to ethically do our job. And that means we have to be able to review the video, provide the defense attorneys a discovery. And so we just don't want to be left out of the discussion. It's not just the police department. It's not just the data center and the server space to store the videos. Our offices need some support too. I'll give you a great example, Delegate Levine, about why I'm such a big supporter of body-worn cameras. 2 years ago, I was asked to be a special prosecutor and to investigate and review an officer-involved shooting in another jurisdiction far away from Northern Virginia. And that jurisdiction happened to have body-worn cameras. And so as a prosecutor, obviously we have to work in the world of evidence. And the best evidence you can have is video of what actually occurred. And here I had multiple camera angles of the incident. And I was able, therefore, to not have to guess about anything. It was very clear, every single thing that occurred from the beginning of the encounter with the citizen until the end of it. And that was a huge benefit. Otherwise, we would be relying on witness recollections, witness statements. You can't get better evidence than video of what actually occurred. And in that case, it did allow me to make a decision that we had to charge the officers. Okay, so having that video is super important. Obviously, I think in most cases, it's going to lead to, as the chief pointed out, a prosecutor deciding that the officers were rightfully doing what they were doing. At least we have a video and we know exactly what's happening. But in those cases where it's not, we have nothing to fear. We need to get to the bottom of that. Video is the best way of holding people accountable. And you don't have to guess what's going on. It's exactly word for word, second for second, what actually occurred. Can't get any better evidence than that. So I completely, wholeheartedly support the idea of body-worn cameras.
Well, Parisa, if a police officer had a body-worn camera in an encounter with a citizen and turned it off at, not when they're driving around, but let's say a relatively critical moment, and then turned it back on again later on, after the critical moment was over. Could that be used, the mere fact of turning off the camera, could that be used against that officer in a court of law?
I mean, that's what the presumption is right now in terms of the recording of interrogations. So it's not automatic, but there is, certainly an argument to be made that if at a key moment the recording is turned off, then that is problematic. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why some equipment might malfunction and that sort of thing, but I think that, it's certainly something that would go into my analysis, and it's something that, if opposing counsel would be in a position to ask for a jury instruction, for example, if we're at a jury trial, that there should be a presumption against that officer because they turned it off.
Brian, Chief Brown had to go, and I respect that. He told me that ahead of time. So I'm sorry to give you this question, but I think you probably know the answer. You may not know why, but you probably know the answer. Chief Farr mentioned that Arlington has cameras on their police cars. This person wants to know if Alexandria has any cameras on cars. I think the answer is no. Is that right?
Yeah, the answer is no. That Alexandria doesn't have body-worn cameras, and they don't have dash cameras or any cameras on the cars, to my knowledge.
And again, folks, this isn't Brian's fault, but if you happen to know, and if you don't want to address it, Brian, you don't have to, because I'm sorry to throw this in your direction. It may well be a question of cost, but do you have any indication as to why Alexandria doesn't have them?
I honestly don't. That's a question for City Council.
Right.
Chief, that's beyond.
Right. I understand that's not a question for you. Chief Farr, one question that's been asked is, maybe actually let me ask this first to Brian, and then I'll get to Chief Farr. If a police officer obscures their name badge, so let's say someone's recording them, a police officer that's in an encounter with a citizen, somebody's recording them, and the police officer, not accidentally, but covers their badge or something like that, could that be used against them in a court of law?
Well, that's kind of a hypothetical. It is. Yeah. I assume the answer to that question is yes. If the situation was correct, I guess a lawyer can make an argument that you're trying to conceal yourself because it's consciousness of guilt. So I guess the answer to that question would be yes. In the right circumstances, it could be used against them in court.
Chief Farr, there have been questions about hiring police officers. Two questions I wanted to ask you from different people. One is, do police departments have recruiting policies to promote racial diversity? And the other question relating to recruitment is, do you try to get folks in Arlington, or at least in Northern Virginia? They mentioned that in Minneapolis, some 90% of the officers did not live in the city. I know that it costs a lot to live in Arlington or Alexandria, a lot more than it does to live in Prince William or other counties. And I know that many of our police officers are not residing in our community. But the question is, do you work to ensure both racial diversity and police from this area if you can?
So yeah, as far as the policies go, it is we recruit really heavily to maximize the diversity of the agency, and so all of our recruiting literature, all our brochures that go out, you're going to not just see it's not all white. We looked really hard that we know we have to bring in folks that better represent the community we serve. And if you look at our numbers compared to our partners in the region, while we don't match them 1-to-1, we have a pretty fair ratio that's moving in the right direction to get a ratio that's really reflective of our community. A big push that we've put out is when we don't use it just the traditional methods anymore. We go back, one of the most successful programs we've had now is going back to our colleges where, we have a college degree requirement. So our ambassador programs puts people back in all of our colleges. So we don't just do a one-day recruiting fair. We go back and we meet with the staff, we meet with the instructors, and we are developing long-term relationships with all these universities to maximize the number of people we bring in and the diversity we bring in. So it's very much a policy decision for us, and it's very much we strive for it every year. The question you had around the name tag, by the way, it's against our policy. So it may not be a criminal charge, but if you fail to identify when somebody asks you, it's against the policy agency. We expect you to identify. And you had a second part
The
of
other
that.
question was not just about racial diversity, but about geographic diversity,
Right.
or actually lack thereof. Do you have people who live in the community? Is that hard to do for you, given the cost of living in Arlington? And have you tried to prioritize local police officers?
We don't make it just an absolute priority to get local police officers, but currently we have a fairly high number of people that live in the county. The real challenge for us, I think it's somewhere almost 50%, but the real challenge for us is typically what ends up happening is that the younger officers live here initially. When they get to the point where they're going to have a family, it's almost always at that point, if you want a house and you want any property, the cost, you know what the cost is here, they move out of the area. But generally, most of them are within a reasonable distance from the county. But I have people come from as far away as Easton, Maryland and Gettysburg, Virginia. So it's a mix. But we, as much as possible, we love to get people from the Arlington community.
There's another issue here, Chief Farr, that folks are raising in different contexts. I don't know if you saw the video, I saw it, of the woman in Central Park where an African-American man asked her to put her dog on a leash, and she called 911, said that the man was threatening her, which obviously he was not. And this relates to, I don't know, there's an expression used among some African-American groups talking about Karens. I feel bad for all people named Karen, but the idea is of a white person calling the police for a very, very minor or no crime at all. Someone just selling, I think there's one for selling lemonade. There's one for walking a dog in the park. Some of these lesser things, like you mentioned, I can understand someone not wanting marijuana smoke in their house, but maybe seeing someone sit on stoop, alcohol. I'm curious to know whether you found a lot of these frivolous or very minor calls from citizens that may have a racial bias, and how do you deal with this problem that we've seen across the nation of some white people calling some black, calling the police for a minor violation or no violation at all? I'm just curious if you can address that. It's a tough question.
Well, okay. The good news is I can tell you that we really don't have that many. They occur. I won't tell you they don't occur. And the most typical type of thing will be, I have someone of X in my neighborhood, and I think it's suspicious. The most important thing that officer can do, because we're going to have to go. We get a call for service. Somebody says, I want you to come. The police are going to go. The most important thing that officer can do, though, is when they get there, is spend the time and engage with the individual that they stopped and say, this is why we were here. This is what the call is about. We're just responding to find out the facts of the case, and be very forthright with them and honest with them as to why they're there. I find that people are far more willing to work with the police if you just tell them, look, I got a call from somebody in the neighborhood. I'm not up here just to harass you because you're in the neighborhood. This is what I'm checking on. That's it. Thank you. Have a good day. And then be informative with them. But the good news is, like I said, it's not that frequent, but we do get them on occasion.
Not that frequent means what? 5 in a year, 10 in a month? What is not that frequent?
Number, but I can tell you how many times things come on my radar where somebody says, I was stopped by the police for no reason whatsoever. It is a rarity for me. It's probably more problematic, and when we get a lookout for somebody, and this is very typical. So we have a shoplifting at a 7-Eleven, or we have whatever it might be, and some poor guy or gal is walking down the street who's done nothing. Next thing you know, they're surrounded by 3 cruisers saying, we need to stop you. The critical thing there is tell them why you stopped them. Explain the reasons for the stop. I can tell you most of the time, some people, and I've encountered this when I was a cop myself, they may not be happy about it, but they're usually accepting the fact that the police stopped them and told them what they're being stopped for. The worst thing you can do is run up on somebody and say, grab hold of them or stop them from their movement and then not explain anything to them and then take off. Then I get why people think they're being harassed, because we didn't take the time to explain what we were doing.
Are there any consequences for, and again, I apologize for using this expression, particularly since I see a Karen on the line, but for the Karens of the world, is there any consequence for someone who calls in a frivolous complaint to the police?
Delegate, I
yeah.
can handle that.
Yeah, go ahead,
So
Brian.
with the circumstances, what happened in Central Park, those exact facts are punishable as a crime in Virginia. So there's a crime called making a false police report. So in that case, it's a little bit different than what the chief's talking about. Okay, I mean, there her intent was obvious. She was lying. She was intentionally lying to try to get an African American man into trouble with a law enforcement officer. So on those facts, I think it'd be very easy to prosecute her in Virginia for filing a false police report. And obviously, if that occurred in Alexandria or Arlington, I'm sure Parisa would back me on this. I mean, we would definitely follow through with that case and prosecute it. So I think that's the answer to your question about consequences.
So the woman in Central Park, yeah, it's a pretty extreme case, and I've seen that video, and it was very disturbing. I'd be curious to know, and I guess I'll throw this back at Chief Farr, if you find someone who, I don't know, doesn't make a false complaint, but complains that the man's on his stoop drinking a beer. I'll use that example since it's one you gave, which may be technically illegal, but I mean, I don't. Is there a way to tell someone, maybe that's a bad example because that's technically illegal. But let's say there's a strange man on my stoop, all right, or a strange man on my sidewalk, and that's because that's not illegal.
Okay, so if the only thing the person calls in and says, there's somebody in my neighborhood and I don't know them and I want you to check it out, we're not going. I saw a thing here on where they said, why do you have to stop? We're not going. But and that's not uncommon where you'll get a call and say, well, I don't recognize this guy and maybe I think he's up to something. And the dispatchers will probably stop it right there by saying, are they really doing anything? Now, time and day and consequences make a big difference.
Sure, if it's 3 in the morning and they're looking in your window.
You call me at 12 o'clock at night and they say there's somebody suspicious walking down and looking at cars. We get larcenies out of cars like you wouldn't believe in this county. We're going to send somebody out and they're going to investigate further. If it's 12 in the afternoon and the guy's walking down the street and that's the extent of it, the officer's never going to go there. There's never going to be a complaint. To Brian's point, if there is clearly a false report being filed, we will place charges on the false report because you're putting us out into a position to use police action inappropriately.
So I've done my best to ask in some form or another all of the questions I've seen. Are there folks, and again, if this were a monthly meetup and we were all meeting at Los Tios, you all would have a chance to stand up and speak, and I don't want to take that voice away. Are there folks that want to ask a question directly that haven't posted it in the video in the chat room? Just write in the chat room and just say, I'd like to speak. I want to give you that opportunity to speak. I am looking through questions again to make sure there isn't something that I've missed. I also know that our public officials here are very busy, and first of all, I just really want to thank Chief Brown, who's gone, you, Chief Farr. I called you at the last minute last night. Parisa and Brian, whom I called yesterday. I mean, you all came at a moment's notice, 24 hours notice. And I think all of you are very hardworking public servants. I'm very proud to serve with all of you. This incident in Minneapolis and Louisville. Oh, Louisville. Before I go on, I did want to address that. That's really important to me. And this is a question for our prosecutors. I'll start with Parisa. In Louisville, for those of you who don't know, Breonna Taylor was a woman in her own home. There was a no-knock warrant issued to police officers to come into her house to look for drugs. There were no drugs there, by the way. They did not announce, well, I wasn't in Louisville. It's alleged they did not announce themselves. And it's alleged that the woman who had these police barge into her home without announcement, allegedly, shot at one of them, and then they shot some 20 shots in the house. She had 8 bullets in her body. It's a terrifying situation for someone who woke up in the middle of the night in their own home. What is your position, or what is Virginia's law? Because I don't know, and maybe I need to work on it, on no-knock warrants. And I'll start with you, Parisa. You're muted. You need to unmute yourself, Parisa. You have to unmute yourself, Parisa. There you
Hi, sorry. It's a pretty in the weeds question, but my understanding is that you're not supposed to do no-knock warrants unless there's a danger to the police officers or the possibility of evidence being destroyed. And why that happened in that particular case.
They claimed that they were afraid they were going to destroy the drug evidence.
In the middle of the night? I mean, so, I mean, I don't want to argue with that, but I so far have not seen that happen in Arlington. And I'm pretty confident that it wouldn't happen unless it was truly exigent circumstances.
Brian, what's your view on no-knock warrants?
Well, I mean, the law in Virginia, as Parisa stated, is you don't need, the police don't need prior judicial authorization to execute a warrant no-knock. They are supposed to be able to articulate a significant amount of facts and circumstances that would lead the officer or officers executing a warrant to believe that they are going to be in danger if they knock and announce, or alternatively that evidence is going to be destroyed. It's not supposed to be a rubber stamp cut and paste situation where you can always say, hey, we're looking for narcotics, and therefore there's always a chance that the drugs are going to be destroyed. It's supposed to be very, very specific facts that are outlined on a case-by-case basis. I will say that's a tactical question, Delegate Levine. It's really beyond my expertise. From a legal perspective, that's the law. It's really a officer safety tactical question. So I think it's probably better answered by the chief.
All right.
But that is the law in Virginia. It's the no-knock warrant.
Chief Farr, when would you seek a no-knock warrant?
Well, I think Ms. Tafti hit on the head. We do very few of them. Generally, if we're going to do it, it's going to come back with approval from a deputy chief or from myself. And more often than not, we do a no-knock. It's generally, I won't say all the time, but it's generally because there's a really high threat to the police going in. We know the person has a violent history. We know they possibly have weapons in the house. We know that the chances are that we're going to encounter something that may be more dangerous. But I will tell you, whenever possible, the police, at least in Arlington, and I eventually say around Northern Virginia, we'll do everything we can to get somebody outside of their residence. So it's going to be, we'll get them when they've come out and before they get in their car and take them right out there, because it reduces the risk factor for everybody. It reduces the risk of us going in the house and forcing a confrontation, and it reduces the risk of any of our people or the person we're stopping being injured. So it's used very judiciously here.
Actually, Marianne Anderson has an announcement that she wants to make. For those of you who don't know Marianne, she's a wonderful person in the community that I've known for a number of years. I won't steal your thunder, Marianne. Why don't you make your announcement?
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you. Before I do, I just want to comment on Chief Farr. He has mentioned several times the fact that the officers communicate with the people, let them know why they're being stopped or whatever. That's really all about community communication. And I find that really refreshing and interesting and almost educational. That is so key. It is so key to good relationships. Okay, enough of that. I'm allowed to have this moment here because we are organizing a peaceful, I stress the word peaceful, vigil for George Floyd. And, I'll forget the names, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna and others through the ages. We're having a peaceful vigil this Thursday, June 4, beginning at 7 o'clock at Charles Houston Rec Center. And we don't know how small or how big it might be, but so many of us, myself included, which is why I started into this, feel the need to be in community, even at some social distance, and share my grief and my sorrow and my sadness, and maybe my resolve for the future. I don't know how that will be. But anyway, I want for you folks to know that that's taking place at 7 o'clock on Thursday, and to invite you to come and to invite you to share that information with anyone you might like to, and come and share your own sorrow. And one more thing, there is no place for revenge or anger in this. We simply want people to wear masks and bring a sign or say something that is meaningful from the heart regarding this current tragic situation. That's this Thursday. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Marianne. I intend to be there, and I'm looking forward to it. And that's Thursday, June 4th,
right,
at 7 p.m. at the Charles Houston Rec Center.
Right. We'll meet in the back in the parking lot, and then go single file, which is our attempt to be social distancing, and then meet in the front for anyone who's going to be speaking. And perhaps, Mark, you'll be one of those people.
I would be honored to. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank
there
you.
are still a few more questions. Mostly still directed at the police officer. We under a lot of. Michelle, did you have a question? Did you want to say something?
No, I was looking and seeing that there were 17 people on the call, and I was wondering if anyone was from the NAACP.
If they're here, they can announce themselves. You put it in the chat, or you can just talk. I haven't seen anyone specifically from the NAACP here, though I believe Jacob Weinberg, my chief, sent out an invitation to them. And I know there will be other town halls.
Well, we're trying to put together a prayer vigil.
Okay.
Hopefully at the police station, because right now that's where the most angst is with the police.
Tell me when and where, please.
We haven't gotten a date because we need to find out if we need a permit and if we'll be allowed to.
I don't know that you need a permit, but maybe Chief Farr knows. If they want to do a peaceful protest at the police station, one in Arlington, would they need a permit? I don't know the answer to that.
I'm talking about Alexandria, I'm sorry.
Well, Alexandria, okay.
The answer would be the same. No, generally the only time you're going to require, it's a First Amendment protection. The only time you generally need to get something is if you're going to impede the ability to move traffic, or we need to block traffic or block other things off. That's generally when they're looking for a permit. The mere fact that somebody's there in and of itself, no, there's no limitation.
Someone's on the sidewalk or something like that, there would not need to be a permit.
No.
Did that answer your question, Michelle?
Yes, it does. It helps a lot because we'll be meeting on Monday to try to put together some details. So we'll let people know. Thank you.
Please let me know too, because that sounds like something I'd like to attend myself.
Yeah, the only thing I'd ask is, it'd be typical of any of them, if they would just give the police department a call saying they're planning on having a demonstration, and I'm sure Chief Brown's staff will accommodate them. It's just easier for us to do that when we know.
Yeah, better if you don't surprise.
Yeah, I was waiting.
Always best if you don't surprise people. I concur with that. Chief Farr, one of the questions that was asked, this is by Carolyn Griffin, was what policies exist for police to have regular sessions where they can express frustrations, concerns, issues amongst themselves, where they've seen something, maybe they've seen, and I'm extrapolating here from her question, but maybe they've seen a fellow officer do something wrong, maybe they're having post-traumatic stress in their jobs, maybe they've undergone some incident where they need to talk about it. Is there a way for police officers to express their frustrations, have therapy sessions, whatever, to get out some of the frustrations and difficulties of being a police officer?
Yeah, we've worked pretty extensively over the last few years to make sure that not only employee assistance programs, but got a really solid handle working with our partners in the fire department and the police department. So any avenues that are available for counseling, for how your insurance will cover it or not cover it, what's available for agencies that specifically understand the world of dealing with law enforcement versus a general practitioner. I mean, much of that, those resources are pushed out on a regular basis and made available to our officers as well as our civilian staff quite frequently. I mean, especially you can imagine the stress that everybody's under these days. We're trying to make sure that we push that out frequently. But yes, there are opportunities for all of our officers to seek counseling as they desire.
can officers lose their certification for misconduct? ACLU Virginia, this person says, has said they can't be. I can't imagine that that's true, but I'm going to throw that to you. Chief Farr, can you lose your certification for misconduct?
You know, I saw that question, and I know that when you are terminated for cause in Virginia, but the police department does not hold a certification for the officer. In Virginia, the Department of Criminal Justice Services holds certification. And so that's what I'd actually have to follow up on, is the mere fact that I've terminated you for cause, will that necessarily mean you'll lose your certification in Virginia? That I don't know.
I think I can answer that because
Okay, go ahead, Brian.
I'm on the board of the Department of Criminal Justice Services, and I'm on the executive board. So I've actually participated in decertification hearings and appeals. So the way it actually would work is if an officer has been terminated for cause, DCJS is supposed to be notified of that. They then can, I don't really know the criteria exactly, but they can, the state agency can move to decertify and make a decision to decertify. And then the officer, if their license has been revoked, has a right to appeal to the executive board. And then 6 to 7 of us on the executive board would sit and hear the appeal. In the 3 years I've been on DCJS board, I think I've heard 3 or 4 appeals. And my recollection is that all 4 of them, we upheld the decertification. So it does happen. I'm not sure how frequently it does because I'm only seeing the ones that are appealed to the full board. But in 3 full years of being on that board, I think I've participated in 4 or maybe 5 hearings on appeals of decertification. So it does happen. And one delegate, unfortunately, I have another call.
I understand. You've stayed way longer frankly than I expected you to. So I really appreciate your being here for this amount of time. Chief Farr has been a real trooper, pun not intended, in being here this long. There's still a few more questions that I will try to answer, but let me just take this moment to thank the 3 of you tremendously, to thank Chief Brown. It's nice to live in a community where we're at least thinking about these issues. My goal, my hope, my prayer is that we never have to face in Alexandria and Arlington what we see all across the country, including just across the river in Washington, D.C. And the more we can proactively ask and face these questions, the more we can prevent that from happening. This is enraging. This is sad. This is depressing. It's scary. And I'm not a person of color. I suspect it's magnified 10 times for folks like that. And it's depressing. And I don't know, just before y'all sign off, if there's any sort of uplifting words. When will this end? When will this be over? When will we finally be able to completely trust our police officers, our leaders, our communities? We've had racism for 400 years. I know it's not going to end tomorrow or in the next decade or so, but what message of hope? I guess I'll let you end with that. Can you, Brian, you said you had to go first, so I guess I'll send you first. If you have any sort of general message about what's going on in the country and what people can take away that hopefully gives them a bit of optimism and hope.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's no words that can make what happened right. And I'm definitely, it's really one of the poverties of the career I've chosen is that I'm usually in a position of having to react to situations. And what I mean, usually we'll talk about a homicide case where I'm dealing with a family who has lost someone to a murder. I can't make that right for the family. There is no such thing as closure in those situations. There's no justice for a family who has lost someone to violence. And in this case, that's triply so, right? You've got a family in Minneapolis who has lost a loved one to a total and complete and unnecessary act of violence. And no words that me or the chief or Parisa could say can make that right. And I'm totally aware of that. All I can tell people is that I personally, as a human being, I'm personally outraged at what occurred. I'm personally dedicated to doing everything I can to make sure that it does not occur here. I do believe that we are blessed in Northern Virginia to have outstanding law enforcement partners like Chief Farr and Chief Brown, who run very clean departments. I don't personally believe that there is any officer in the Alexandria Police Department or the Arlington Police Department with a history of complaints like that officer had in Minneapolis who would still be allowed to work and wear a badge and be out on the street. So what I can tell people is I share in the outrage, and I can give you my word that in the unfortunate and hopefully never occurring situation where we have something like that happen in Northern Virginia, if it's my job to take a look at it, I will do it with a very, very, very intense eye. I will look at the evidence. I will honor the evidence, and I will apply the law like I've done to every other single case I've done in my entire career, and make the very best decision I can under the law. And so I am personally very, very pleased to be able to tell the people on this call that we have law enforcement professionals in Northern Virginia who hear you, who do understand your outrage, and who understand your fears, and who are doing what they can to address them. But we do need communities, and we do need very, very engaged people like those on this call to stay engaged and let us know what you're thinking and let us know what your questions are, so that going forward, it's not just 1 2-hour conversation like this, it's a continuing conversation so we can try to address those concerns and those fears. And I'd like to personally thank you, Delegate Levine, for hosting this call and for giving me an opportunity to participate. Obviously, I want to thank Chief Farr and Parisa for being colleagues and for being like-minded law enforcement professionals. And then finally, I want to thank all the citizens who took time out on a Sunday afternoon to let us know your thoughts and ask those really probing and very important questions. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Let's just continue on and hope and pray that this does not occur in Northern Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Chief Farr, do you have some closing words you want to share with us?
Well, I think Brian said a lot of he's absolutely right. We can't fix what's happened, but I can tell you this, and I like to use my Stephen Covey stuff. There's a saying in Stephen Covey, seek first to understand to be understood. I am an absolute believer that the only way we continue to move forward is we keep an open dialogue and we keep talking. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. We continue to do these in our own community, and I truly believe as long as we're willing to have that dialogue, we can keep moving in the right direction and work through some of this. But I think it's going to be some challenging times ahead, and there's no doubt about that. And things like this really help us move forward. So thank you very much. And thank you for just know my commitment to everyone out there has always been to do the very best we can to have a professional police department. And we're going to continue moving in that direction as well.
Thank you, Chief Farr. Parisa, I give you the last word, at least from the group here.
I mean, the chief and Brian said most of what I would have said. I think that I want to just make 2 points. And the first is that this isn't new, what we are going through. It really is connected to 400 years of our history. And I think that we're seeing a lot more of it now because we have frankly, a president who is encouraging and inciting the worst in people. And I think that what we need to be focused on is not only having an open dialogue, and I'm very encouraged about the dialogues that we're having. I think it's important to not be in a defensive crouch and to call out wrong when we see it. But I also think that we need to support leaders who are willing to do those things and willing to take a really hard look at our history and willing to look at actively addressing racial issues and to borrow from the book, being anti-racist, not just sort of passively not racist, but actually actively being anti-racist. So, and looking at all of the things that we take for granted to root out, where we are being trained to have implicit bias and where we potentially might have it that we didn't even see before. And, I think that where we are today in this community is a really good start to that. And I think we can lead the country in that.
Thank you, Parisa. So Sonia Rosen asks, will you, I don't know if she means me or the rest of you, will you take a knee to stand against police brutality? Will you march with folks protesting? Other police departments across the nation are doing so. Put down your batons, guns, and shields and join us. Be a part of the solution, not the problem. Learn to be in solidarity. I assure you, Sonia, yes, I will and have and will continue to take a knee to stand against police brutality and march with folks protesting. And I think most of the good people on this call will do so. This is just the start. This isn't even just the start. This is a continuing conversation. We need to talk more about policy and things to do. I'm always open to discuss changes in state law. There's a wonderful bill, as you know, as the chief mentioned, that I co-patroned to require detailed data, detailed transparency about every police stop in Virginia. I was proud to co-patron that bill. It became law this year. I was proud of my body cameras bill, which I've been working on for 5 years straight, became law this year to require transparent policies when you set up body cameras. This is a very long discussion. I want you to know that I'm always open. Usually in my monthly meetups, y'all spend more time talking. I apologize. I know I synthesized your questions instead of giving them all of you to say. I tried really, really hard to address every question I saw either in the chat room or in the RSVP. Next monthly meetup in June, I will give each of y'all more of a chance to speak yourselves. It was more a matter of time, and I knew that that Parisa and Brian and Chief Farr and Chief Brown had to go. So again, I apologize for sort of encapsulating all of this. I want to let you know that I take this personally. Last night, as I watched the America in Flames from Washington, D.C., just across the river to Philadelphia, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, I'm reminded what Dr. King said. He said that riots are the language of the unheard. And while, of course, I think that violence is counterproductive, it does not solve the problem. Dr. King knew that well. Obviously, he is the best example of nonviolent, successful protest in America. And people are burning down their own neighborhoods and destroying many Black-owned businesses and so forth. So while I think it's counterproductive, I'm not defending it. I also recognize that people are in pain right now. People are, we've got 100,000 dead from COVID so far. It's growing. We got 40 million unemployed. We have continuing systemic racism, continuing police officers in broad daylight, killing a Black man. There's a lot of anger out there and rage and justified rage. So I would say, I hope you feel that you're being heard. And if you don't feel you're being heard, I'm really accessible. Call me, talk to me, offline, online. I think most of your city officials, county officials would say the same thing, state officials. Let us know how you're feeling. I'm proud to join in the protest that's being organized on Thursday. And I'm proud to stand with you all. And I will continue. Those of you who are regulars know I've hosted a monthly meetup every single month since I first ran for office in I think my first one was May of 2015. So it's been 5 years now. This is my 5th year anniversary doing these. I want to remain accessible to you. And I want to thank all of you for attending. You know, we had more than 100 people. The damn Zoom room, and I apologize, I didn't know this in advance, restricted people to 100. I didn't know that was gonna happen, and I do apologize for that. We did, as soon as I knew we were restricted, I started recording this. I will post the recording. It'll be out, I think, on Twitch, someone said. And
just to chime in, that Twitch was streaming it real time. I was able to get the audio out. The video, there were some issues and complications.
okay.
And one thing that I wanted to chime in, because I tried raising, a lot of this has been talk of increasing number of cameras, and with that, it makes it a little harder to sort through. So I just was wondering if there's any consideration being given towards funding any efforts either towards further folks for review and analysis, or looking at automated tools to help be able to parse through larger sections. And that's kind of probably a more of an ongoing question for later, but just figured something to bring up. It's not just being able to produce that, but the ability to actually look through and make sure we're able to find out what's going on.
Thank you, Maxwell, for that. I've actually been working on body cameras personally for 5 years now. It's an issue that I ran on and I care very strongly about. I think when I focused on it first 4 years ago, they were not as in vogue as they are today. So the answer, the restrictions I've always heard were about cost. And I think, and I don't want to speak for Parisa or Brian, but I think they would tell you that I don't know, they would trust fully an automated system, that they're required to give us culpatory evidence under the Brady rule. And I think they would tell you that they need a seasoned person to look at these tapes. And that requires cost. That requires hiring people. One of my first budget amendments was to suggest a 50-50, where localities in the state each pay 50-50 for police body cameras. I have to tell you, under Republican control, that was simply a no-go. There was just not support for that. The bill that I succeeded, that's going to become law in July, is a start. It requires transparency and written policies for body-worn cameras. It's actually the first body-worn camera bill ever become part of the Virginia Code. It's the law that I wrote. But I will be the first to tell you, this is a start. This is not a completion. There are many different systems all around the Commonwealth. You probably know that. From body-worn cameras to police to on cars to Alexandria doesn't have either of them. I will always be there to support that funding. It requires funding. It requires money. And right now in this COVID time, we lack money more perhaps than any time since, well, in the last 20 years. So it's probably going to be a no-go at least for another year. But I am committed to getting that funding. And I would love to work with you, Maxwell, on particularly that issue. It's something I've been focused on for 5 years now.
Yeah, and that's greatly appreciated. And I'm sorry if I caused confusion. I didn't mean like a totally automated, but just automated tools in regards to assisting the analysis of the data. Because as you point out, it does require that human supervision to take a look and review. But I'll thank you for responding, and maybe we can chat offline.
We can always chat offline. Again, I want to thank all of you for attending. Like I said, we had 100 people. I don't know how many more would have come in, 150, 200, if we didn't have that damn technological restriction that I'm going to do my best to work around for next month. Though I don't, you know, my monthly meetups, normally it's 30 to 70. I can only recall one other time when we've gone over 100. That's when I had a primary challenger in 2017. But what it shows is just the power of this issue. I'm reminded of last year when I had a discussion in a wonderful church in Alexandria about Ralph Northam, Justin Fairfax. Many of you attended that discussion. This was intended to be somewhat like that. And we had probably 150, 200 people at that discussion. I want to thank all of you, particularly those of you who've been around here for 2 hours listening all this long. It shows your commitment. I have to say, I'm very proud to live in Alexandria, to represent Arlington and Fairfax. We have problems in our communities. We have racism in our communities. I know that's true, but I also think we have a lot of good people who are working very, very hard to restrict it, to limit it. And if you hear of incidents, do not hesitate to call me. I will keep you confidential if that's your concern. If not, I'm more than happy to let it go to the right person. Don't ever suffer in silence. Don't ever feel you're at the point of rage where you need to, act violently. You don't. Come join our vigil that Marianne is and Boyd and John Chapman are putting together. A wonderful vigil. Please join us. Express your frustrations there. Let your policymakers know how you feel. If you feel that you've been mistreated by the police and you've called in, you've made a complaint, and you don't feel your complaint is getting processed properly, call me, call Brian Porter, call Parisa Tafti. These are some good people here, and I really think we're struggling hard. And now I've kept y'all 2 hours and 12 minutes. I want to thank you. The conversation will continue. And of course, I will have my monthly meetup next month at the end of June. Thank you all for attending. I think a very important session. So take care, everybody.